All right, welcome everybody. We are starting today with Shrimad Bhagavata Mahapurana, Book 9, Discourse 8. Discourse 8 is the story of King Sagara. Sri Shuka resumed, continuing with the lineage that he's been tracing. We had just been talking about Rohita. Harita was the son of Rohita, and from Harita sprang up Champa, by whom was built the city of Champa. And of Champa was born Sudeva, whose son was Vijaya. Vijaya's son was Bharuka, and from Bharuka sprang up Vreka, whose son again was Bahuka. His land having been usurped by the enemies, King Bharuka retired to the forest along with his wife. Intending to follow the aged king who died in the forest, the queen was stopped by the sage Aurva, who knew her to be enceinte, which is a very archaic word for pregnant. By her co-wives who came to know this, poison was administered to her with her food through jealousy, evidently trying to cause her to miscarry the child. But no harm came to her. On the other hand, a highly renowned son was born of her along with that poison, and came to be known by the name of Sagara. So the usual meaning of Sagara, the most common meaning of Sagara is the ocean or sea, but it can also refer to poison or poisoned. It's used as a word for the ocean in the sense of non-drinkable, to refer to the salt water. So its actual meaning is like inedible or like dangerous to drink. So he was named Sagara. Sagara turned out to be a universal monarch, a Chakravartin, and by his sons was dug out the ocean, which was thenceforward named after them as Sagara, another reason for the name. In deference to the advice of his guru, the sage Aurva, he did not kill, even though he had conquered, the Talajanghas, Yavanas, Shakas, Haihayas, and Barbaras, but only caused them to be disfigured as follows. These are enemies who had attacked him and who he had captured. Some he had thoroughly shaved, while others he left with beards and mustaches. Some he left with only disheveled hair, while others he left with their heads half shaven. Some he caused to be stripped of their undergarment, while he had others shorn of their outer garment. In other words, just to humiliate his enemies and then show mercy on them, rather than killing whenever avoidable. In the manner pointed out by the sage Aurva, he propitiated by means of a number of Ashvamedha Yajnas, Lord Sri Hari, his very self, manifested in the form of all the Vedas and the divinities. Indra, the destroyer of his enemies' towns, stole away his consecrated horse, released as a prelude to the Yajna. Yet again, we've heard of Indra doing this before. Looking for the horse in obedience to their father's command, the proud sons of Sumati, one of the two wives of Sagara, numbering 60,000, excavated the earth down to the sea level on all sides. While carrying on their excavation in a northeasterly direction, they perceived the horse by the side of the divine sage Kapila. "Here is the thief who stole the horse, sitting with his eyes closed. Let this wicked fellow be killed and killed." Shouting thus, they rushed towards him with uplifted weapons. Since Indra had planted the horse here as a trick. At that moment, the sage opened his eyes. Deprived of their good sense by the powerful Indra, and already killed, so to speak, by their having offended against an exalted soul like the divine Kapila, they were instantly reduced to ashes by the fire of their own body. So Kapila's glance used the Agni Tattva within their own bodies to instantly kill them all. It is not correct to say that the sons of Sagara were burnt by the wrath of the sage. How can tamoguna in the form of anger be conceived in him who is an embodiment of pure sattva, and whose divine person is capable of purifying the whole universe, any more than particles of dust belonging to the earth can be conceived as attaching to the sky? How could there be a sense of difference as between a friend and a foe in the omniscient Lord Kapila, who is the same as the Supreme Spirit, and by whom has been launched in the ocean of this world the strong vessel in the form of Sankhya philosophy, with the help of which a seeker after liberation is able to cross the ocean, so difficult to cross, of worldly existence, the pathway to death. He who is referred to by the ignorant under the name of Asamanjasa, which is an insulting name, was another son of Emperor Sagara, born of Keshini, his other wife. And Asamanjasa's son, who was devoted to the interests of his grandfather, King Sagara, was named Anshuman. Asamanjasa, who was given to contemplation in his previous birth, but had strayed from the path of yoga through evil association, which is perhaps the reason for the name Asamanjasa. Although he still remembered his previous birth, showed himself as a wicked fellow. He did what was reproachful in the eyes of the world, and as such unpalatable to his relations. For example, he hurled forth playing children into the river Sarayu, thus frightening the people. So in other words, just like, pushed kids into the river. He was a bully, in other words. Conducting himself in this way, he was actually forsaken and exiled by his father, who set aside his parental affection. Showing to his father as still alive the children, by virtue of his yogic power, Asamanjasa departed from that place, which was Ayodhya, the place where they were dwelling, the city of Ayodhya. Seeing their lost children as having returned, all the residents of Ayodhya felt much amazed, O Parikshit, and the king Sagara too was filled with great remorse. Commanded by the emperor, Anshuman, Asamanjasa's son, went out in search of the sacrificial horse by the path dug out by his uncles, and discovered the horse near a number of heaps of ashes, presumably the ashes of the 60,000 sons. Beholding Lord Vishnu, who is above sense perception, seated in the garb of a sage bearing the name of Kapila, the great Anshuman glorified the Lord with a collected mind in the following words, bowing down to him with joined palms. Anshuman prayed, "Even Brahma, who is not born like us, is unable even to this day to perceive directly through samadhi, or even to comprehend through reasoning of various kinds, you who are higher than his own self. How then could other living beings belonging to various species, such as gods, humans, and subhuman creatures, evolved by his mind, body, and intellect, the products of sattva, tamas, and rajas, respectively, much less we, devoid of light, perceive or know you? They who are identified with a body and are consequently dominated by the aforesaid three gunas, whose intellect is bewildered by your maya, and whose light illuminates only the objects of senses, which are external to the mind, perceive only such objects of senses during their waking and dream states, and sheer darkness in the other case during deep sleep. They are unable to realize you who transcends the three gunas, even though you ever dwell in them as their very self and inner controller. Such that you are, how can I, an ignorant person, investigate you, who are knowledge personified, and are fit to be contemplated upon by sages like Sanandana, who have by their very birth got rid of the notion of difference and infatuation, born of the attributes of Maya. O Lord, let us therefore simply bow to you, the most ancient person, in whom the aforesaid attributes of Maya, actions prompted by them, as well as bodies engendered by such actions, are altogether absent, who have no material name or form, who are entirely free from punya and papa, who have by your own independent will assumed a divine form in order to teach wisdom to your devotees. In this world evolved by your Maya, people revolve in the midst of houses and other objects of senses, taking them to be real, their intellect being deluded by lust, greed, jealousy, and infatuation. Today, O Lord, the very self of all created beings, by your darshana, the strong cord of our ignorance, in the shape of identification with the body and so on, the root of all craving for sensuous enjoyment, as well as of actions prompted by such craving, and the indriyas, the instruments of such actions, has been cut asunder. Sri Sukha went on. The divine sage Kapila, whose glory was thus sung by Prince Anshuman, mentally blessed the said Anshuman and spoke to him as follows, O protector of men. The glorious Lord Kapila replied, this horse, the animal to be sacrificed by your grandfather, Emperor Sagara, may be taken away by you, dear child. So Kapila evidently had kept the horse all this time. And these uncles of yours that lie burnt here stand in need of the water of the holy Ganga and nothing else. Walking round him from left to right as a mark of respect and bowing to him with his head bent low, the prince brought back the horse to Ayodhya. And with that animal, Emperor Sagara concluded the yajna, which had remained uncompleted all these years. Having entrusted the kingdom to Prince Anshuman, Sagara, who was now free from all craving and had thrown off his fetters in shape of identification with the body, etc., reached the highest goal by following the course recommended by his guru, the sage Aurva. Thus ends the 8th discourse, hinging on the story of Sagara, and Book 9 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. Discourse 9, the story of King Bhagiratta and the avatarana of the holy Ganga. Sri Shuka resumed. Even like Sagara, who renounced his kingdom, Anshuman too abdicated the throne in favor of his son and practiced asceticism for a long time with the desire to bring down from heaven the holy Ganga, as Lord Kapila had told him to. But he did not succeed, and in course of time he passed away. His son Dilipa too was unsuccessful like him and met his death in the course of his efforts. Dilipa's son was Bhagiratta, and he too performed very great tapas. The goddess Ganga got pleased with his devotion, which was evidently greater than the devotion of his father or grandfather, and revealed herself in person to him, saying, I am prepared to confer a boon on you. Thus spoken to by the goddess Ganga, the king Bhagiratta bent low with humility and submitted to her his object in carrying on his austerities. And she said, somebody must sustain my force as I descend on earth, or else she would break the earth with the force of her power striking it. Piercing the hard crust of the earth, otherwise a protector of men, I shall penetrate into Rasatala. Further, I am not inclined to go down to the terrestrial region, for people will wash away their sins into me. Where shall I wash off that sin, O Bhagiratta? Let some thought be bestowed on this point. King Bhagiratta submitted. Pious souls who have given up attachment to actions as well as to their fruit are pure of mind, foremost among the knowers of Brahma, and capable of purifying the whole world, shall wash off your sin through the very contact of their body while bathing in your water. For in them, in their heart, dwells Sri Hari, the destroyer of sins. Again, Lord Rudra, the very self of embodied souls, into whom this universe is woven warp and woof as a piece of cloth into its threads, will bear your force. Having spoken thus, the said king Bhagiratta proceeded to propitiate Lord Shiva by means of his austerities. And after a very short time, O Parikshit, the Lord Shiva became highly pleased with him. Having accepted the king's prayer, saying, so be it, Lord Shiva, the friend of the whole world, cautiously bore on his head the Ganga. Cautiously as in cautious not to let any part of the stream miss him and strike the earth with full force. The Ganga whose water stands hallowed by the touch of Sri Hari's foot. The said Rajarishi, Bhagiratta, led the Ganga, which is capable of purifying the whole universe, to the spot where the bodies of his great-granduncles lay reduced to ashes. Closely following Bhagiratta, who rode in advance in a chariot swift as the wind, and hallowing the lands on its way, the Ganga bathed the burnt-up sons of Sagara. Though destroyed by their own offensive behavior towards a holy Brahmana, the sons of Sagara ascended to heaven through the mere touch of its waters with their ashes alone. When the aforesaid sons of Sagara rose to heaven through the mere contact of its waters with their body converted into ashes, what need be said about them who make use of this heavenly stream with reverence every day, having taken a vow to this effect? That which has been said here with regard to this heavenly river, emanated as it is from the lotus feet of the infinite Lord Vishnu and therefore capable of ending transmigration, is not something which should excite great wonder. For by fully concentrating their mind on those feet with reverence, pure-hearted sages have speedily attained oneness with the Lord, shaking off their identification with the body, a product of the three gunas, identification with which is so difficult to give up. From the loins of Bhagirata sprang up Sruta, whose son was Nabha. Of the latter was born Sindhudvipa, of Sindhudvipa Ayutayu, and from him sprang up Rituparna, a friend of Nala, who received the knowledge of training horses from Nala, imparting to him in return the secret of winning the game of dice. And Rituparna's son was Sarvakama. From Sarvakama sprang up Sudasa, and his son, O king, was Saudasa, the husband of Madayanti, whom people actually called Mitrasaha, while in some places they referred to him as Kalmashapada. Due to the curse pronounced by the sage Vasishta, his guru, he turned out to be an ogre, or was turned into an ogre, and had no issue, no children, in consequence of his own action. The king Parikshit submitted, what was the occasion for the curse pronounced by the Guru Vasishta on the high-souled Saudasa? We desire to know this, which may kindly be pointed out to us, unless it is a secret. Sri Shuka replied, while roaming in pursuit of game, so the tradition goes, in other words, hunting, Saudasa, son of Sudasa, killed a certain ogre, properly we're translating the term Rakshasa, and let go his brother, who immediately left with the intention of retaliating. Contemplating harm to the king Saudasa, he assumed the form of the latter's cook at his palace, and having dressed human flesh, took it to his guru, the sage Vasishta, who had called at the palace with intent to dine. Immediately perceiving human flesh about to be served to him, the glorious sage flew into a rage and uttered an imprecation on the king, saying, you will surely turn into an ogre through this conduct of yours. Learning in the meantime that it was the work of an ogre and not the king, the sage limited the curse to a period of 12 years only, while Saudasa too in his turn took water in the hollow of his joined palms, fully prepared to utter a counter curse on his guru, who had cursed him for no fault of his. Stopped by his wife Madayanti, and finding the four quarters, the sky, and the earth all instinct with life, the king Saudasa dropped that harmful water, burning with the fire of his wrath, on his own feet, lest it might injure any other living being. And thus he justified his appellation Mitrasaha, which means he who is indulgent toward his friends and well-wishers. Blackened in his feet by the action of his own curse-charged water that he dribbled onto them, and hence named Kalmashapada, and having acquired an ogre-like disposition or form for 12 years in account of his guru's curse, Saudasa saw one night a Brahmana couple dwelling in a forest at the time of copulation. Pinched by hunger, Saudasa seized the Brahmana with the intention of devouring him, whereupon his wife pleaded like one afflicted, you are no ogre as such, you are a great car warrior among the scions of Ichvaku and the husband of Madayanti, O valiant monarch. Evidently she knows who he is and is trying to recall him to that knowledge. You ought not to do what is adharmic. Pray restore to me my husband, who is a Brahmana and has not yet attained his object of life. This human body, O king, is capable of yielding all the objects sought after by a jiva. Therefore, the destruction of this body, O heroic king, is spoken of as the frustration of all one's objects. Indeed, this Brahmana is not only learned, but endowed with asceticism, an amiable disposition, and other virtues. He seeks to worship the absolute Brahman by the name of Lord Vishnu, the Supreme Person, which, though present in all created beings, is screened by ego, etc., the products of the three gunas, by looking upon all beings as his very self. As such, how can he, the foremost of Brahmana sages, deserve death, O Lord, knowing what is right, at the hands of the foremost of Raja Rishis in you, any more than a son at the hands of his father? How can you, esteemed of the righteous, approve of the death at your own hands of this pious and sinless Brahmana, an expositor of the Vedas even when unborn, any more than you would the slaughter of a cow? If, in spite of my protest, this Brahmana, without whom I shall not survive even for a moment, is to be made a victim by you, then first devour me, as good as dead. In spite of her pleading pitifully in this way and crying like a helpless woman, King Saudasa, who was deluded by the curse of his guru, devoured the Brahmana, even as a tiger would devour a beast. Finding her husband eaten up by Saudasa, who behaved like an ogre, and lamenting herself, the chaste Brahmana woman, full of anger, cursed the king, saying, since my husband, O wicked soul, has been devoured by you while I was stricken with love, Your death too, O foolish one, will be shown by me to follow from sexual intercourse. Having cursed King Mitrasaha and the aforesaid words and consigning her husband's bones to a flaming fire, the lady, who looked upon the world of her husband as her ultimate destination, followed the course of her husband. Rid of the curse of his guru at the end of the 12 years, and fully intent upon copulation, he was stopped by his wife, Madayanti, who had come to know of the curse pronounced on him by the aforesaid Brahmana lady. Thenceforth, he gave up the pleasures of sex, and consequently did not have any issue, due to his own action. Entreated by him, the sage Vasishta begot an issue through Madayanti. She actually bore the child in her womb for 7 years, during which time the boy did not see the light. Vasishta then hit her abdomen with a stone to send her into labor, and the boy was for that reason called Ashmaka. Ashmaka literally means basically hit with a rock. From the loins of Ashmaka sprang up Mulaka, who is effectively protected against the wrath of Parashurama by women who shielded his body. Hence, due to that episode, which we have not told here in detail, he was called by the name of Nari Kavacha, which literally means woman armor. When not a single Kshatriya was left after the extermination of the Kshatriya race by Parashurama, it was he who served as the stock of the regenerated Kshatriya race. Hence, he became known as Mulaka, meaning like the well or the seed of the clan, essentially. Of Mulaka, Dasharatha was born, and from the latter sprang up a son. This is not Dasharatha Rama's father, but Dasharatha the first. From Dasharatha the first sprang up a son, Aidavida. Of Aidavida was born Vishvasaha, whose son Khatwanga turned out to be a universal monarch, a Chakravartin. Hard to conquer, he slew demons in battle at the entreaty of the gods. On coming to know at the conclusion of the battle that only an hour's life was left to him, since the gods told him this, he forthwith returned to his capital by an aerial car lent to him by the gods, and concentrated his mind on God. He said, "Neither life, nor sons, nor riches, nor earth, nor kingship, nor wife is dearer to me than the Brahmana race, the adored of my family. Even during my childhood, my mind never took delight under any circumstance in unrighteousness, nor did I ever find any other reality than the Lord of excellent renown. Although a boon of my choice was offered to me by the gods, the rulers of the three worlds, in exchange for his aiding them in war, I did not hanker after such enjoyment, engrossed as I was in the thought of Lord Vishnu, the maker and protector of all beings. Even the aforesaid devas, whose senses and mind are bewildered by the objects of senses, fail to discover their beloved Lord, ever present in their own heart as their very self. How then could others know him? Therefore, shaking off by means of devotion to the maker of the universe, the attachment rooted by the very nature of things in their mind for the objects of senses, which are products of the three gunas, produced by the Maya of the Lord and no more real than a fanciful project, I hereby betake myself to him. Having thus resolved by force of his reason, which was drawn towards himself by Lord Vishnu, who has his abode in the primal waters, and shedding his ignorance in the form of identification with the body and so on, which are other than the real self, Khatwanga forthwith regained his essential character, the divine state which is the same as that transcendent absolute, which, though not unsubstantial, is conceived as intangible because it lies beyond the range of speech and other organs, and is very subtle, which devotees of God undoubtedly refer to as the Almighty Lord Vasudeva. Thus ends the 9th discourse, forming part of an account of the solar dynasty, the Suryavanshi, and book 9 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. Discourse 10 mainly consists of an account of Sri Rama's pastimes. Sri Shuka resumed. From Khatwanga sprang up Dirghabahu. Evidently, Dirghabahu was born or at least conceived before he went to war against the Asuras. Dirghabahu, the long-armed one, of whom was born Raghu of wide renown. Indeed, Raghu was of such wide renown that his line after him was often, it still was called the Suryavanshi, the solar dynasty, but was often called the Raghuvanshi. So renowned was Raghu. From Raghu sprang up the great king Aja, of whom Dasharatha II was born. Again entreated by the gods, Lord Sri Hari himself, who has already been seen by you in your mother's womb, Shuka said to Parikshit, and who is entirely constituted of the absolute Brahman, assumed the role of a son to the blessed Dasharatha, appearing in as many as 4 forms under the names of Sri Rama, Bharata, Lakshmana, and Shatrughna, himself in his entirety as Rama, and his brothers were part manifestations. So in other words, Sri Rama was a Purana avatara and the 3 brothers were Ansha avatars. The story in the form of a chronicle of the aforesaid Sri Rama, the spouse of Sita, has already been narrated in detail, O Parikshit, by rishis like Valmiki, who had realized the truth, and has undoubtedly been heard by you time and again. I shall accordingly content myself with reproducing it only in a nutshell. Having abandoned for the sake of redeeming the pledge of his father, King Dasharatha II, his title to kingship, Sri Rama roamed about from forest to forest by his lotus feet, which were too soft for the touch of the petal-like hands of his beloved consort Sita, so to speak, himself having known princely life. His fatigue from the journey being relieved now and again by the blessed Hanuman, the monkey chief, and his own younger brother Lakshmana, who accompanied him to the forest and massaged his feet and other limbs, along with Hanuman from time to time. The deity presiding over the ocean was terrified by the display of Sri Rama's brows knit in anger, excited by the grievous separation from his darling Sita, which had been brought about by the mutilation of Shurpanakha, sister of Ravana, the demon king of Lanka, so called because she had fingernails as big as a winnowing basket. Her nose and ears were chopped off by Lakshmana at the instance of Sri Rama because she attempted to eat Sita alive. An incident which provoked Ravana to steal away Sita in the absence of Sri Rama and Lakshmana. By that lord of Kosala, who subsequently caused a bridge to be built across the sea and exterminated the host of wicked demons, including Ravana, even as a wildfire consumes a whole forest, protect us. So Kosala, he's called the Lord of Kosala because Kosala was the name of his kingdom, whose capital city was Ayodhya. Earlier, in the course of a sacrificial performance of the sage Vishvamitra, Maricha and other demon chiefs who roamed about and carried on their nefarious activities at night were beaten by Sri Rama all alone, Lakshmana standing as a mere spectator. Picking up in the midst of an assembly of world-renowned heroes the formidable bow of Lord Shiva, lying in a hall specially built for the choice marriage, the Swayamvara, of Princess Sita, and brought conjointly by 300 men, he strung it, and then drawing it, broke it in the middle, a protector of men, as sportfully as an immature elephant would snap a stick of sugarcane. Having won Sri, the goddess of beauty and prosperity, whose virtues, disposition, age, limbs, and appearance matched his, who had already secured an honorable place on his bosom, and who now bore the name of Sita, her avatar, he tamed while on his way back to Ayodhya the overgrown pride of Parashurama, the chief of the Bhrigus, who had thrice 7 times swept the earth clean of the seed of the Kshatriya race, except, of course, for Kulaka. The Lord accepted with his head bent low the command of even his luxurious father, King Dasharatha II, who was bound by the cords of truthfulness and relinquishing his claim to the throne of Ayodhya, the imperial fortune, his loving relations, his mother and so on, his friends and dwelling place. Even as an ascetic who was shaken off all attachment would give up the ghost, Sri Rama left for the woods along with his divine spouse Sita. While in the forest, he mutilated the features of Shurpanakha, as we've heard, the sister of the demon king Ravana, a woman of unclean mind. Again, specifically the reason why he had Lakshmana mutilate her was in punishment for her having just attempted to eat Sita alive. Slew her kinsmen, numbering not less than 14,000, Kara, Dhushana, and Trishira being the foremost of them, and roaming about with an irresistible bow in his hand, led a hard life in order to teach a lesson to humanity. Observing the demon Maricha deputed in the form of a weird golden deer, a protector of men, by Ravana, the 10-headed monster, whose passion had been kindled on hearing a description of Sita from the lips of Shurpanakha, and drawn away from his hermitage by the aforesaid deer, he forthwith killed Maricha with an arrow, even as Virabhadra slew Daksha Prajapati. On Sita, the daughter of Janaka, the ruler of the Videha territory, having been forcibly carried away in the forest during his absence by Ravana, the vilest of the demons, even as a sheep is snatched away by a wolf, the Lord, who was thus disunited from his beloved consort, wandered in that forest along with his younger brother Lakshmana like a forlorn creature, exemplifying in that way the sad plight of those attached to women. Having cremated like a devoted son Jatayu, the king of vultures, who had all his stock of karma wiped out through his heroic action in the shape of a duel with the mighty Ravana, for his own sake, for the deliverance of his beloved spouse from the clutches of that tyrant. The Lord slew the demon Kabandha, who had stretched out his arms to seize him. Then, cultivating friendship with the Vanaras, or monkey people, Sugriva, Hanuman, and others, and ascertaining through them, when Vali had been killed, the whereabouts of his darling, the Lord, who behaved as a human being, even though his feet are worshipped even by Brahma, the birthless creator, and Lord Shiva, the source of creation, marched with the forces of Sugriva, the ruler of the Vanaras, to the seashore. The deity presiding over the ocean found the Makaras in it agitated by a fierce glance cast by him in seeming anger, provoked by his failure to appear before the Lord in spite of his waiting for him for 3 days without food and water. May its very roar silenced through fear. Therefore, assuming a living form and taking articles of worship on his head, he approached the Lord's lotus feet and spoke as follows. Dull-witted as we are, O infinite Lord, we are unable to know you, the most ancient person, the immutable supreme ruler of all the worlds. Surely you are no other than that Lord of Prakriti, from whose sattvika aspect sprang up hosts of divinities, from whose rajasika aspect the various Prajapatis, and from whose tamasika aspect appeared the lords of ghosts, the Bhutanatas. Be pleased now to march across the ocean at your will. Slay Ravana, the refuse of his father, the sage Vishrava, who by his atrocities makes the 3 worlds weep. Recover your spouse, O valiant one, and for the expansion of your fame, construct here a bridge, reaching which monarchs intent on the conquest of the 4 quarters may sing your glory. Having accordingly constructed across the sea a bridge with mountain peaks of every description, full of trees, the boughs of which were shaken by the hands of Vanara chiefs who handled them, the Lord, accompanied by armies of Vanaras, led by Sugriva, Nila, and Hanuman, entered under the guidance of Vibhishana, the fortress of Lanka, already burnt by Hanuman in course of his quest for Sita. With its sports grounds, granaries, treasuries, doorways, city gates, council chambers, porticos, and pigeon cots, occupied by the army of Vanara chiefs, and its platforms, flags, jars of gold placed on both sides of its entrances, and crossroads being destroyed. The city shook like a river churned by herds of elephants. Perceiving this calamity, Ravana, the lord of the Rakshasas, deputed Nikumbha, Kumbha, Dhumraksha, Durmukha, Surantaka, Narantaka, and others, his son Meghanada, Prahasta, all his followers headed by Atikaya and Vikampana, and afterwards his younger brother Kumbhakarna, to meet the invading army. Accompanied by Sugriva, the lord of the Vanaras, Lakshmana, his own younger brother, Hanuman, son of the wind god, Gandhamadana, Nila, Prince Angada, Sugriva's nephew and heir apparent, Jambavan, the king of the bears, Panasa, and others, Sri Rama marched against that army of the Rakshasas, which was difficult to penetrate, armed as it was with cutlasses, sulas, which are basically like steel spears or pikes, bows, prasas, rishtis, javelins, tomaras, and swords. Meeting in a single combat the hostile army, all the aforesaid generals of Sri Rama, the lord of the Raghus, Angada, and others, struck with trees, rocks, maces, and arrows, the Rakshasas whose lord Ravana had all his good luck wiped off by the abduction of Sita. Enraged to see the destruction of his army and mounting the aerial car Pushpaka that had been snatched away by him from Kubera, the god of riches, his brother, Ravana, the lord of the Rakshasas, forthwith marched against Sri Rama, shining brightly in a splendid heavenly car brought by Matali, the charioteer of Indra, and struck him with sharpened arrows having crescent-shaped heads. Sri Rama said to him, O refuse of ogres, I, whose prowess cannot be prevailed against, shall award this very day to you, who have cast all shame to the winds, even as Kala does to a perpetrator of sin, the fruit of your detested action, consisting in the fact that our beloved spouse was stolen away during our absence by your wicked self, who behaved like a dog. Scolding him thus, the Lord discharged at him an arrow fitted to his bow, and it split his heart hard as adamant. Like a virtuous soul whose stock of merit is exhausted, Ravana fell from his aerial car, vomiting blood through all his 10 mouths, in the midst of his people, crying, Dear me, dear me. Issuing forth from Lanka in thousands, with Mandodari, the principal consort of Ravana, Rakshasa women now rushed weeping bitterly to the spot where Ravana and their other husbands and sons and fathers and so on lay dead or dying. Hugging each her own relation struck down by the shafts of Lakshmana, they helplessly wailed in loud tones, beating their person with their own hands. Alas, undone we are, O Lord. O Ravana, who made the whole world weep by your tyranny, bereft of you and overrun by the enemy, whom should Lanka seek as its protector? Swayed by passion, you did not realize, O highly blessed one, the extraordinary power of Sita's glory, by which you have been reduced to this miserable plight. Widowed is this Lanka as well as we, O delight of your race. Your body has been made the food of vultures and your soul rendered fit for hell. Sri Shuka continued. Encouraged by Sri Rama, the uncrowned king of Kosala, Vibhishana, the youngest brother of Ravana, performed for the benefit of his kinsmen whatever is ordained in the scriptures by way of obsequies according to the procedure laid down for a sacrifice intended to propitiate the Pitris, in other words, Pitri Sraddha for the dead. The Lord then saw in a retreat in the Ashoka garden his most beloved spouse Sita, emaciated due to the disease of separation from him, and seated at the foot of a Sinshapa tree. Sinshapa is the same as the Ashoka tree, 2 words for the same tree. Observing her in that wretched plight, Sri Rama was filled with compassion. Bestowing on Vibhishana the rulership of the Rakshasa hordes, the city of Lanka, and longevity extending to the end of the Kalpa, and first helping Sita, the lotus of whose countenance was now blooming with joy caused by his full vision, to mount the aerial car Pushpaka, the Lord, who had now completed his vow of residing in a forest for 14 years, stepped into the car himself along with his 2 brothers, meaning his brother Lakshmana and his adopted brother Sugriva, since Rama and Sugriva swore blood brotherhood with each other. And further accompanied by Hanuman, they flew back to his capital Ayodhya, showered over on the way with flowers offered by the guardians of the various worlds, his heroic deeds being joyfully celebrated by Brahma the Creator and others. The highly merciful Lord, however, felt much pained to learn about his younger brother Bharata, who, covering himself only with the bark of trees, was living on barley boiled in the urine of cows, wore matted locks on his head, and slept on the ground strewn with blades of the sacred kusha grass. Because he took a vow that if his brother Rama was deprived of the comforts of the royal life, then he too would forego them until Rama returned. Hearing of Sri Rama having arrived, Prince Bharata placed on his head the latter's wooden sandals, which Rama had lent to him at his request. And accompanied by the citizens of Ayodhya, his ministers and family priests, proceeded from Nandigrama, where he was camping, since he had also vowed not to enter the city of Ayodhya till Sri Rama's return, so he was living in the village ashram of Nandigrama, just outside of Ayodhya, to meet his elder brother in the midst of songs and sounds of musical instruments, and accompanied by great exponents of the Vedas, repeatedly chanting in loud tones sacred texts from the Vedas, by flags with gilded edges, chariots of gold decked with flags of various colors, noble horses with trappings of gold, warriors protected by gold armors, traders of every description, courtesans and servants following on foot, and also taking with him the royal insignia in the shape of the umbrella, the chowry fans, and so on, and valuable commodities, jewels of every description, great and small, by way of presents. Placing the wooden sandals before Sri Rama, he dropped down at his feet, his heart and eyes moistened with love, and stood with joined palms and eyes full of tears. Placing the sandals has additional significance here because um, Bharata was in practice ruling the kingdom, but as a sign that he felt that Rama was the rightful king, not only did he never enter the city or enjoy any royal luxuries, he placed Rama's sandals on the throne. And so by placing the sandals before him, he's basically encouraging Rama to resume the throne. Keeping him folded in his arms for a long time and bathing him with tears flowing from his eyes, Sri Rama himself, along with Lakshmana and Sita, offered his greetings to the Brahmanas as well as to those others who were most deserving of honor, and he was in turn saluted by the people. Observing their lord returned home after a long time, the inhabitants of North Kosala joyfully danced, waving their upper cloths and showering flowers on him. Bharata took his pair of wooden sandals, Vibhishana, along with Sugriva, who stood on his right and left, a chowri and an excellent fan, respectively, and Hanuman, son of the wind god, who stood behind the Lord Rama, held the white umbrella over him. Shatrughna, the youngest brother of Sri Rama, bore his bow and 2 quivers. Sita held the kamandalu, the coconut shell containing the water of sacred lakes and rivers. Angada carried his sword, and Jambavan, the king of the bears, carried his shield of gold, O protector of men. Seated in the aerial car named Pushpaka, attended by dancing women and panegyrized by bards, the Lord shone brightly, O king, like the rising moon in the midst of minor planets in the sky. Welcomed by his younger brothers, the Lord entered the festive city, and on entering the royal palace, duly honored his stepmothers, Kaikeyi and so on, his own mother, the blessed Kausalya, the gurus of the city, Vasishta, his own guru, and others, his equals in age as well as those younger than he, and was honored in return by them. This homecoming, by the way, occurred on Deepavali, and it's one of the main things that the festival of Deepavali celebrates. Sita and Lakshmana too met them in a befitting manner. Rising from their seats like dead bodies returning to life, the aforesaid mothers of these princes placed their sons on their lap, and bathing them all over with a flood of tears, shed their grief of separation from them. Causing the matted locks of Sri Rama to be unraveled, the sage Vasishta, his guru, along with the elders of his race, the Raghus, bathed him with the water of the 4 oceans and other sacred waters, even as the sage Brahaspati, the guru of the Devas, bathed Indra. Having thus washed his whole body, not only his head, clad in beautiful attire and adorned with wreaths of flowers and ornaments, the Lord shone with his brothers and consort Sita, who were all well adorned with jewels and elegantly dressed. Won over by his brother Bharata through prostrations, Sri Rama accepted the throne of Ayodhya, and like a father protected the people of his kingdom, who were all devoted to their respective duties and endued with the characteristics of their own varna and ashrama, while they in their turn recognized him as their father. So long as Sri Rama, who knew what is right and brought happiness to all created beings, reigned as king, time was like Krita Yuga, though actually Treta Yuga prevailed. Forests, rivers, mountains, varshas, dvipas, and oceans all yielded the desired objects of the people, O chief of the Bharatas. While Sri Rama, who was the same as Lord Vishnu, ruled as king, mental and bodily ailments, old age, self-disparagement, sorrow, grief, fear, and fatigue were non-existent. Death, too, did not overtake the unwilling. Observing the vow of having only one wife throughout his life, and conducting himself like a sage, even though a king, the pious Lord himself scrupulously performed his household duties in order to give a lesson to the world. By her affection, obedience, amiable disposition, intelligence, and bashfulness, Sita, who was not only virtuous, but meek through humility and knew his intention, captivated the mind of her divine spouse. Thus ends the 10th discourse, forming part of the narrative of Sri Rama in Book 9 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. Discourse 11, further pastimes of Sri Rama. Sri Shuka resumed. Guided by his guru, the sage Vasishta, the divine Sri Rama himself propitiated by means of sacrificial performances conducted with excellent materials his own self in the form of Lord Vishnu, representing all the gods on his person. At the conclusion of the yajnas, the Lord gave away, by way of the fees, the eastern quarter to the Hota, the southern quarter to the Brahma, the western quarter to the Advaryu, and the northern quarter to the Udgata chanter of the Samaveda. To his Guru Vasishta, he gave away the entire land that remained at the center, recognizing as he did that the Brahmana alone was entitled to the whole of this earth, himself being free from all craving. In this way, Sri Rama, who had given away his valuables in cash too, was left with the ornaments and the 2 pieces of cloth he had on his person. And Empress Sita, daughter of Janaka, the ruler of the Videha country, was left only with her Mangala Sutra, the auspicious thread, typically with a piece of gold at the center, worn by married women around their neck as long as their husband lives. Since she had given away every other ornament that she owned to the Brahmana women. Delighted to witness the most praiseworthy parental affection of the Lord, who is so fond of the Brahmanas, they, however, returned all that to him and spoke as follows, their mind moistened with affection. As a matter of fact, what has not been given to us by you, O Lord, O ruler of the universe, when we know that entering our innermost heart, you wipe out our ignorance by your divine splendor? Hail to Lord Sri Rama, a votary of the Brahmanas, the foremost of those enjoying excellent renown, whose wisdom knows no obstruction, and whose holy feet are cherished by those who have given up all forms of violence. On a certain night, while moving about incognito and unperceived in the capital with the intention of knowing the mind of the people, Sri Rama overheard the following remarks of someone concerning his own spouse Sita. I would have you no more, a wicked and unchaste woman that you are, since you have lived in the house of another. King Rama, who is excessively fond of his wife, may retain Sita in his house, but I'm not going to accept you again. Forsaken by her divine consort Sri Rama, who is afraid of the ignorant and myriad-mouthed world, which could not be easily placated, Sita reached the hermitage of the sage Valmiki, son of Pracheta, the god of water. Not the main god of water, Varuna, but another god of water. Being enceinte, it's using this archaic word for pregnant, she gave birth, when the time came, to twins, who became known as Kusha and Lava. The sage Valmiki performed the purificatory rites concerning them. The 2 sons of Lakshmana were called Angada, named after his great friend Angada, the Vanara chief, and Chitraketu, while Taksha and Pushkala were the 2 sons of Bharata, O Lord of the earth. Subahu and Srutasena were the 2 sons of Shatrughna. In the course of his conquest of the quarters, Bharata slew Gandharvas in tens of millions, who ended up in a war with him. There's a whole long story about that. And bringing their wealth to Ayodhya, presented it all to the king Sri Rama. Again, getting rid of the demon named Lavana, son of Madhu, Shatrughna, for his part, founded on the site of that battle, in the forest of Madhuvana, a city known as Mathura. Having committed her sons Kusha and Lava to the care of the sage Valmiki, and contemplating on Sri Rama's feet, so the tradition goes, Sita, who had been exiled by her divine spouse, found her way into the bowels of the earth that parted asunder to take her. Hearing of this and recalling her manifold virtues, Sri Rama, the Almighty Lord, could not restrain his grief, even though he tried to suppress it by force of reason. Excessive fondness of men and women for each other is always such as brings fear and grief in its train even to powerful souls, and much more to a voluptuary whose thoughts are riveted on his household. Since then, for a period of 13,000 years without interruption, the Lord poured oblations into the sacred fire, observing a strict vow of celibacy. Leaving in the heart of those who remember him an impression of his feet, tender as a pair of young leaves, pierced earlier by the thorns of the Dandaka forest, Sri Rama then left for his own effulgent divine realm. Extirpation of demons through the instrumentality of multitudes of missiles and the bridging of the ocean, this is no praise to Sri Rama, the Lord of the Raghus, who assumed a form for the sake of Leela at the entreaty of the gods, and whose glory is absolutely matchless and unsurpassed. Did Vanaras actually serve as his helpmates in disposing of the enemy? No, not at all. Destruction of demons was as good as play on his part. I seek as my protector the aforesaid Lord of Raghus, whose unsullied glory, which is capable of destroying sins and serves as an adornment for the elephants guarding the quarters, Sages sing in royal courts even to this day, and whose lotus feet are touched by the crowns of rulers of heaven like Indra, and custodians of wealth like Kubera. All those people of the Kosala country by whom he was lovingly touched or fully observed or seated by their side, or even followed while moving about, reached the goal which yogis attain to. A man treasuring up in his mind the narrative of Sri Rama through the repeated process of hearing, and pledged to a vow of tenderness and cessation from violence, O Parikshit, is freed from the shackles of karma and the shape of virtue and sin, which make for transmigration. The king Parikshit submitted, how did the said Lord Sri Rama conduct himself, and how did he behave towards his brothers, who were his own selves or part manifestations? How again did they, as well as his subjects and residents of Ayodhya, behave in their turn towards him, their almighty Lord? Sri Shuka replied, Sri Rama, the ruler of the three worlds, now charged his younger brothers with the conquest of the four quarters, and himself looked round the city with his followers, allowing himself to be seen by his people. With its roads sprinkled all over with perfumed water and fragrant drops of temporal fluid emitted by rutting elephants, the city looked highly inebriated, as it were, to see her lord arrived. It was adorned with domes of gold set on the top of palaces, city gates, council chambers, sanctums, and temples, as well as with flags. It had festal arches erected by means of fresh areca nuts joined with their footstalks and banana trees fixed in the ground, strips of beautiful cloths, mirrors, tapestries, and wreaths of flowers. With articles of worship in their hands, citizens met him at various points and pronounced their benedictions on him with the prayer, protect, O Lord, this earth, lifted up of yore by yourself in the form of the divine boar. On learning that their Lord had arrived there after a long interval, the people, both men and women, forthwith climbed up to the top of their mansions with intent to see him, leaving their household duties, and showered flowers on the lotus-eyed Lord, their eyes still unsated. The Lord then returned to his palace, occupied in the past by his own predecessors, rich and unlimited treasures of every kind, and equipped with an invaluable variety of articles of household use. The palace was graced with entrances having thresholds of coral, rows of pillars of cat's eye, transparent floors of emerald, and walls of shining crystals, wreaths of various colors, flags, cloths, gems, and canopies, pearls effulgent as consciousness, and all luxuries coveted by men, fragrant incenses and lights and decorations of flowers, and attended by men and women akin to gods and lending charm to ornaments themselves rather than vice versa. In that palace, the said Lord Sri Rama, the foremost of wise men reveling in the self, enjoyed life, so the tradition goes, with his beloved and affectionate spouse, Sita. Nay, the Lord, whose feet, tender as young leaves, are contemplated upon by men, enjoyed pleasures of sense, each at its proper time, for very many years, taking care not to twist the principles of dharma. Thus ends the 11th discourse, forming part of the narrative of Sri Rama, in Book 9 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. And I think we can do one more because it's very short and ends the lineage of Ichvaku for the most part. Discourse 12, the genealogy of the remaining kings of Ichvaku's line. Sri Shuka resumed. Now Kusha's son was Atiti, of whom was born Nishadha, and the latter son was Nabha. Then came Pundarika, whose son was Kshemadhanva, and from the latter sprang up Devanika. Of Devanika was born Aniha, and his son was Pariyatra. From the latter sprang up Balasthala, and of the latter was born Vajranabha, who emanated from a ray of the sun god. In other words, he was an Ansha avatar of Surya Devata. His son was Khagana, and of the latter was born a son, Vidhriti. From Vidhriti sprang up Hiranyanabha, a teacher of yoga and a pupil of the sage Jaimini. From him, the sage Yajnavalkya of Kosala received instruction in yoga relating to the spirit, conducive to great elevation and capable of snapping the knot of ignorance existing in the heart. Hiranyanabha's son was Pushya, of whom Dhruvasandhi was born. Then came Sudarshana, from Sudarshana Agnivarna, and from the latter sprang up Sigra, whose son was Maru, He is the same Maru who, having attained perfection through yoga, stays even to this day as a living inhabitant of Kalapagrama, a famous colony of yogis hidden in an obscure part of the Himalayas. And he will revive the solar dynasty when extinct at the end of the Kali Yuga. So he still lives in a hidden ashram in the Himalayas. From him, from that Maru, sprang up Prasushruta, whose son was Sandhi, and the son of Sandhi again was Amarshana. The latter son was Mahaswan, of whom Vishvasahva was born. Of him was born Prasenajit, and from the latter sprang up Takshaka, not the famous Naga king Takshaka, but someone of the same name. And of the latter was born Brihadbala, who was slain in battle, O Parikshit, by your father, Abhimanyu. These are all the past kings of Ichvaku's line. Now hear the names of the coming ones. So Shuka just fluidly goes into prophecy of the future. Brihadbala's son will be named Brihadrana, of whom will be born. In fact, by this point, Brihadrana must be born, but perhaps Shukadeva knew it through prophecy and not through having heard the news. Of whom will be born Urukriya, and from the latter will spring up Vatsavruddha. Of the latter will be born Prativyoma, from Prativyoma Bhanu, and from him will follow Divaka, a great general. Of him will be born the valiant Sahadeva. Brihadashva will be the son of Sahadeva, and Bhanuman of Brihadashva. Bhanuman's son will be Pratikashva, and the latter son will be Supratika. Then will follow Marudeva. From Marudeva, Sunakshatra, and Sunakshatra's son will be Pushkara. Pushkara's son will be Antariksha. Antariksha's son will be Sutapa, and the latter Amitrajit. Again, Brihadraja will be the son of Amitrajit, Barhi of Brihadraja, and from the latter will follow Kratanjaya. His son will be Rananjaya, and from Rananjaya will spring up Sanjaya. From the latter will follow Shakya, from Shakya, Shudhoda, and his son will be called Langala. Of him will be born Prasenajit, and from Prasenajit will follow Kshudraka. From Kshudraka will spring up Ranaka, and of the latter will be born a son, Surata. From Surata will follow a son, Sumitra by name, who will be the last of his line. These will be all the scions of Brihadbala. This race of the Ichvakus will have its end in Sumitra. For having reached this king, the line will terminate in the Kali Yuga. Thus ends the 12th discourse, a genealogy of the kings of Ichvaku's line, in Book 9 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. And I think that's probably a good stopping point for today.
Thank you, Devala.
Yeah, after this we get into another story and then the lunar dynasty.
Yeah, we have a couple new people here. I think wanted to introduce Mata Hema Rediji. She is awesome Maharshi, well-versed in Maharshi literature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, welcome. Welcome, Hema.
Yes. And Dr. Nisha ji, it's good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you, Nisha ji.
Likewise, it's a long time, but I'm catching up whenever I can. Always good to see you, right? And thank you so much, Devala and Radhaji, for doing this. Yeah, thank you. It's valued a lot. Thank you.
Shri Krishna is using us, it's not us.
Devala, I had a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
How long was Sita in Ayodhya before she was exiled? After the 14-year exile, how long was she back?
Accounts vary.
Right.
There are many versions of the Ramayana, which give wildly varying, that part of the story in particular. In Valmiki, it is, I'm not sure if it's made explicit. Certainly in the Bhagavatam, it's summarized over rather quickly. It does refer to the normal routine of Rama as king being with Sita there. which would seem to imply that she was there for a long time first.
Huh.
And actually, I will point out, the Bhagavatam never said she was exiled. The Bhagavatam makes it sound like she chose to leave.
Wow.
The version we just read over, it did say that Rama forsook her, but it then says that she, in grief, went to the ashram of Valmiki and made it sound like it was her choice to leave.
Wow.
This part of the story is obviously controversial. Interestingly, I happen to have heard that Maharshi Mahesh Yogi's guru, Gurudev, Brahmananda Saraswati, in lectures taught that this part of the story is false. That he claimed that the whole story of the washerman and the exile of Sita never happened and was a later interpolation during Kali Yuga. And there's actually some academic historical evidence for that. The oldest of the manuscripts of the Valmiki Ramayana, the physical paper manuscripts that we have, or leaf manuscripts from ancient India, the oldest one that we have does not contain that story at all.
Wow.
It ends with Rama's triumphant return to Ayodhya and the description of the palace routine. And then the whole last part of the Uttarakhanda is not in the oldest manuscript. It appears only in the younger ones. And there's in terms of substantial differences, like not just like a word here or there, but substantial differences, there are 71 known versions of the Ramayana.
Wow.
And in the majority of them, there is no exile of Sita. It's true that in the version of Valmiki that has come down to us, there is, but again, it's completely absent from the oldest manuscript, and different gurus have weighed in on this in different ways.
Do they go into the story of Love and Kush?
Some of them do, yes. They all agree that Sita did give birth to the twins Lava and Kusha in the forest ashram of Valmiki. But a lot of traditions teach that she did this not because of an exile from Rama, but because she wanted her sons to grow up away from the opulence and materialism of the royal court.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
if we read Dr. Tony Nadaram's last book, the exile is in it, but
yes, it is.
she shows that because she's the perfection of Prakriti, which is part of Purusha. So she was the reason that Ravana was going to be killed.
Yeah.
Because that had to be there, and Kaikeyi had to spell that word that one time, and then later she was sorry for it, right?
Yeah.
So it had to happen in certain sequential order, and that brings back to Maharshi's knowledge, where everything is emergence and then collapse, and that's how things comes to an existence, the play of consciousness. So I think we should always go back to the original script, which is, I think this is how we know it, So what happens also over time, people get identified with their own impurities, and they start telling stories that they think it is correct, and they defend their impurities, and then they say, no, the book is not like that. And that's where you get all the versions.
Yeah. There's tons.
That's what
and also,
I think.
like, many of them didn't have the book. There's all these oral lineages, and a lot of, like, even as far as like in Thailand and Indonesia, they have versions of the Ramayana. It's very widespread.
Yes, yeah. So, but the thing always comes back to what's the correct version, right? And then Maharshi always talks about this part where we meditate and enliven our pure consciousness and come back to regular practice, and that's where we come to higher states of consciousness. Only in higher states of consciousness, when you read a book, right, or anything, or perceive anything, that's where you get the purity of that object. So there are many angles, you can see from many angles, but then there is one that is the ultimate truth, and we're not there. So that's why it's good to meditate and raise consciousness, and that's how we get the highest one. So that's what I thought. It's beautiful of Rajanadaram to write that book of Ramayana and the physiology if anybody has it. It's a great, wonderful book. It's a must read. Yeah.
Now, too, if I may, Devala, there's different versions then of Sita's departure. I know the one where the goddess of earth comes up to the royal. Sita comes back to the royal court with her sons who perform the Ramayana, and then like right after that sequence, she the earth splits open, and the goddess of earth comes out and takes Sita with her down into earth. But
Yes.
What's in the same spirit as what we're discussing right now? What's a more ancient or possible reality of that story?
That particular scene varies less. I mean, it was in the Bhagavatam, again, it's all told in summary, because as Shuka puts it to Parikshit, you know this story already, it's famous, I'm not going to tell it in detail. But he does explicitly mention Sita, quote unquote, finding her way down into the bowels of the earth, which I would basically take to be a reference to that incident. Again, in the oldest manuscript of the Valmiki Ramayana, the oldest physical manuscript that has been found in India, the story is completely absent. The manuscript simply ends with the triumphant return to Ayodhya, and a description of their happy life in the palace, and then it just ends. It never mentions her children, Lava and Kusha, or the end of their lives, or any of that. And so in that version, we don't know. In later manuscripts, the whole story you just told is in it, of her invoking, since the earth was her mother. Her father Janaka found Sita as a baby because a farmer plowing dug her out of the furrow in a crop field. And so she was like a miraculous child born out of the earth, and always revered the earth as her mother. And so the story in the manuscripts is that she called upon her mother to come and take her back, essentially, because it was time for the avatarana to end. The Rama avatarana ended too. He went and took Mahasamadhi standing in water, along with Lakshmana and actually with the entire city of Ayodhya.
Andy, wanted to show you this. If you are going to Fairfield, you can buy this book. And Dr. Tony Nagaram goes in big detail about the ordeal of the fire and the cycle of natural law, the sons of Rama, and why she had to go back to the earth. I can take pictures and send you guys on the app later so that you can read it. It's a great book to read. It's very easy to understand. I speak actually Dutch, so English is quite, but it's really nice to understand. You wrote it very nice.
Awesome. That would be very interesting.
Yeah. Could I give my little input from what I know? I will just take a minute.
Sure.
So have you come across Uttar Ramayana, right? Like the post Ramayana?
Mm-hmm.
So from what you were saying, and this is all we are all learning together, and many things that you share, it's amazing. So all this version after Rama coming in and then living happily ever after into the Ayodhya, and after that, this whole being born of the love and Kush is a part of the Uttar Ramayana, right? And all that I'll just leave it to the later discussion or whatever. So yes, the Ramayana, kind of the original script stopped there. And then all of the versions about the birth of love and Kush and all that is later. So in that manner, yes, it may vary, depends on, their birth and whether it was her choice or not. And then coming back to that point of the birth of a Sita from the earth, okay? And as you mentioned, right, how she was miraculously born, from when the farmer was hulling the land and they found the pot, and in that pot there was a Sita, right? And I think one of the name of her I don't recall, but it relates with being born from the earth. Right? And summing it up to at the end, when the earth departs, what Andy said, when the earth parts and the metaphor of a Mother Earth coming out and taking the Sita back to. So basically consciousness merging within itself. So it came in, like how we say in regards to Purusha and a Prakriti, right? So Sita, basically the Prakriti, the manifestation of the unmanifest, carrying all, probably whatever you call it, the prophet or the message or the evolution or whatever we need to call it, from the Purush, the Prakriti, the collapse of it, relaying anything that it needed to do in that period of the time and merging back into the self. So for me, I look into, it's great to look into the history at its individuals, interest, and we learn a lot from that too. But personally for me, I look into the essence of it, right? More, it's like, what is the content and what resonates with my journey of the soul, than digging into the books and books of the origin, because as we all know by now that it's interpreted or it gets evolved, time after time. And whoever finds the light from that particular portion, they begin sharing that. So there's nothing wrong, and I don't find that anybody is wrong or anything, but it is just that whoever found the essence from it, they just shared it in their way and then continues justifying it. Right. We are all not saying what could resonate as per the Prakriti, right? But the people who would need a different type of material, pick that need the different, Kafu would need a different. So putting it all together, personally for me, I just look into the history is good. What resonates with my soul's journey as per me being the Prakriti itself, in which we are all Prakriti. Right. So that's my
beautiful.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah, you're right. It is. That's what Maharshi explained, that everybody, as you meditate, you evolve. So he even speaks about 7 stages of consciousness. So only in cosmic consciousness, when you regular meditate and transcend and taste the being, and when that is established and walking, dreaming, and sleeping, you come in higher states of consciousness. And that evolves and blossoms to God consciousness, which is Bhagavad Chetana, Brahmi Chetana. In Brahmi Chetana, you of course know much more, and you can perceive this reality as it is, as the Rishis did. But yeah, we're not there. So yeah, you're right. So everybody perceives it on their level. But when I'm there, and there is 5 stages there, I'm just saying something. So that doesn't mean that what I know here is the truth. It's maybe my truth, but the higher truths are much there, So yeah, you.
I mean, it's there, and everyone has an access to it. All I say is, we being the human being, the later developed brain, right? The physicist and all that, we develop the theories. And all the physicists or all the scientists will develop the theories. Okay? What resonates with you, sometimes it's not even necessary to dig, I feel, through the books and counting down the stages of all this, what is described as a theories, right? Somebody just by that innate sense and birth after birth, it's in them. And they may not even need to look at the books or go through the theories, and they could transcend. It's basically transcending, right? Not just the one that stage is, which can be achieved through any means. That's all I would say, as long as you bring all your senses together and focus. And it's not just a one way. It's transcending is a state of a mind which can be achieved through any means, as long as the purpose is for the greater good and not to satisfy the what we call the pleasure of the senses at the gross level. I guess.
Yeah.
I'm done.
All right. Yeah. Thank you all.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
I have to go, you guys, but God bless y'all. It was great to hear about the Ram today.
Yeah.
Thank you always, Andy, for asking the questions. We learn a lot.
Yeah.
It churns my
Thank
inner
you.
part, like all these, older, I don't call it a knowledge, information, and then processing it
Yeah.
after 50 years.
Mhm.
So thank you.
It's a really golden opportunity to be able to ask questions and discuss them and reflect on them with you all.
Yeah.
Thank you, Devila. Great
Yeah.
reading.
Thank you all. Yeah.
All right, Jai Shri Hari.
Jai Shri Hari.